Hi, Diefesters. My name is Rudolph Vincent, and I am the founder of Diefest Global. A warm welcome to you all on the third edition. This year, Diefest will focus on the future of work by addressing authenticity, belongingness, and social impact as some of the most important practices for building a more inclusive and purpose driven workplace for everyone to thrive. Before we begin, I would like to humbly thank our belonging partner Newsilla for supporting our initiative in democratizing world class content and promoting equity in education. On this note, I would like to welcome you to a very important session on overcoming trauma and turning rejection into a successful career, the power of being indigenious. We have in conversation two very profound people with wounds so deep rooted that it requires unbelievable strength and courage to come out and share their stories. What are the long term impacts of intergenerational trauma? Who is this stolen generation lost in time? Here's a conversation on rejection, cultural genocide, unequal access to education, hope, opportunity, truth, and reconciliation. Please welcome Mark Champley from Australia and Valerue Vanderwyk from Canada.
Hello, Valerie. How are you?
I'm fine, Mark. It's wonderful to be here with you and to see you again.
Same here. I feel very privileged, sis. I just wanted to make sure that anyone that's watching or listening to us, that there is an opportunity to ask questions. So there is a chat option here. So please, we encourage if there are any questions or comments, please use that facility. So. Uh, Valerie, I know this is going to be very laid back, and I feel extremely comfortable in our friendship. And I would like to ask the first question. If you could please tell us, what do you think are the similarities between the mobs in Canada and here in Australia?
That's such a great question. And I was thinking about this, and it's incredible how impactful it actually is, even right up until this morning. And what I would like to say is that, when we talk about colonization and the colonization of different countries, and many of us still remaining as part of a commonwealth, the impacts and the similarities between the treatment of Indigenous people here in Canada and in Australia and other areas are really far too eerily similar, which is unfortunate when we think about the global impact that has on individuals, opportunities, equal access to education, equitable access to the same employment opportunities as non-Indigenous peers. And I guess for me, the best way for me to sum it up was from a meeting that I was in this morning with an amazing lady, Michelle Davis from the Ontario Native Literacy Coalition here in Canada. She just came back from 21 days of conferencing and traveling around in Australia, of all places. And there was an Indigenous conference that was going on, and she mentioned something that was very poignant to me, and it just struck me so much. And knowing that I was going to be here tonight, I promised myself I was going to share this. So as we know here in Canada, and maybe others around the world are not familiar with it, but we do have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And what they did was they found 94 specific things that could be done to actually help improve reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, to help overcome a lot of the trauma that has been experienced, and to tell the true history of Indigenous people in Canada. And Michelle was telling me that as she was at this conference, she's walking along past this booth from a group in Australia, and the backdrop said Truth and Reconciliation. So she stopped and she was speaking with them, and she was looking at some of their material. And what she said to me that struck me so incredibly and fits with this question is, she said to them, same thing, different country.
Mm.
So if that doesn't show us what the similarities are, And I think probably even beyond Canada and Australia, with the impacts that colonization has had on Indigenous people around the world.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so interesting, and I believe, Valerie, it really highlights the strong connections that we have with each other, and really the power of truth telling. And that's what I think that's really part of healing. So, um, Valerie, the next question I'd like to ask you, and it's really about your story. I know you're a survivor, and I would really like to hear more about that, and how you maintained and fought for your connection with your culture.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mark. And it took me a long time. And I recently I was on a panel for an electrical energy conference earlier, midweek last week. And it was about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the inclusion of Indigenous people into space. How do we welcome them? How do we start to rectify some of these things that have taken place? And I think it was at that conference when I was there, I mentioned that I am a survivor of the 60s scoop. Um, and that was the best kept secret until about 20 years ago. Because prior to that, trying to explain some of the trauma and the experiences that I went through in foster care with the Catholic Children's Aid Society here in Canada, nobody would believe you.
Mm.
You were instantly labeled, quote unquote, the lying Indian. And they just couldn't conceptualize that people could be treated in such a manner. So you quickly reach a point where you learn to be quiet, right? You learn not to share. And it takes courage to be able to share stories. So the one thing that I like to have resonate with people is that when you have the opportunity to listen to individuals who are brave enough to share their trauma and their stories, please believe them. That's the first thing, right? And acknowledge that everybody's life is not the same. For myself, I can still tell you to this day that it was March 20th, 1972, when I was dropped off at foster care, taken from my family home and my parents, along with my sister, and dropped off in foster care. My social worker's name was Miss Penny, and I remember that she drove a yellow Volkswagen Beetle. Right. So we were brought to this farmhouse out in the middle of these farm fields with this long driveway. I remember her car leaving, and I was taken by my braids, dragged into the house. I was told that I would be called Dirty Little Indian, and I promptly had my braids cut off. Now, for us as Indigenous people, that's our spirit. It represents our strength and who we are, our pride, our connectedness to each other. There are so many things that happen, and that all happened in the first 5 minutes that I was there. My sister was not so fortunate with her ability to overcome these things. It impacted her greatly throughout her life. She ended up taking a different path than I did. And it's entirely because of the treatment that we received. The foster care system in this country managed to strip everything from me. My parents, my siblings, my culture, everything. When I was younger, the Catholic Church had me baptized twice, just in case. In case of what? I don't know. But having the ability to know that going forward has always been something that's really driven me beyond a lot of things, that determination to not be put down and to not stop. I aged out of the foster care system in this country, and I've lived on my own since I was 16 years old. At 16 years of age, I just simply said I've had enough. I've had enough of being labeled. I've had enough of being accused, ridiculed, not knowing who the next family was going to be that I was going to be placed with, and having absolutely no control over these decisions. I remember when I spoke with my eldest sister on one of the few visits that I had with her. I've only ever met her 3 times in my life. She has since passed away. But she told me that when we were first put into foster care, she fought with the Catholic Children's Aid Society to have my sister and myself sent to her to live with her and her husband. And they refused. And that's what we call the scoop here in Canada. When I was 18 years old, I found the courage to go to the Catholic Children's Aid Society and speak with the executive director, who was at that time, it was Bob Light. He too has since passed, to try and find out why certain things were allowed to go on. And at 18 years of age, I certainly felt that it was owed at that stage to me. My sister was going through an awful lot of trauma, mental health issues, run-ins with the law. And it was just devastating to me to watch her life deteriorate so much and know that there was nothing around to assist her. There was nothing to help her or those around her to understand what she had been through as well. And I remember waiting until quite late at night at the Catholic Children's Aid Society before Mr. Light finally agreed to see me. And I had a conversation with him where he told me that while they knew that there were problems in that first foster home that they sent us to, it was very difficult to find good foster homes to put children in. Right. And I remember expressing to him that it must have been, because otherwise they wouldn't have left us there. Now, I'm 18 years old at this point, right? Living on my own. I've finished high school on my own. I'm working full time. I'm trying to save money for a post-secondary education. Because of the way that the country is laid out here in Canada and the laws and the legislation, when my mother married my father, she was stripped of her status. She was no longer considered a status Indian in this country because of who she married. Right? That's just a part of the intergenerational trauma that we experience. Trying to reclaim that can be a very difficult thing. And I remember when I spoke with Bob Light, I asked him if he was aware of the treatment that children in that home were receiving. And he told me that there were still foster children in that home. So I explained to him that he and I were going to make a deal that night, and that he was going to enact an emergency removal of all of the children in that home, that he was going to shut it down, and that he was to never place another child in harm's way in that home ever again. And he told me that he would need to take that to his board of directors. I said, no, you won't, Mr. Light. Tomorrow morning, 9:00, an emergency removal of those children. And in return, I promise not to sue you. He kept his word, and I kept mine. It's interesting, Mark, because a few years after that, I found the courage to go back to that foster home as an adult in my early 20s. And I could not believe it. In hindsight, I would have answered differently. But when I went up to this family, I will not say their name, just to say hello and here I am and this and that. They invited me into the front of their home, and I just felt this chill run over me going in this house. And she reached up into the china cabinet that she had beside the front door, and she pulled out 2 braids. And she told me, she says, these are yours. Do you want them? She kept them. She kept them all those years. In hindsight, I should have said yes.
Yeah.
But at the time, I was so mortified that somebody would keep a trophy like that and to me, it was just a reminder of the trauma. It was a reminder of the pain. And I was just dumbfounded that somebody could take those steps to, I still don't understand it. So for me, when we talk about these sorts of things, by the time I was 10 years old, I was stripped completely of my family. I was alone. My sister and I had been separated. We were only allowed to see each other under supervised visitation once every 4 months. It was just, the intention was there to grow us apart. So for myself and finding my culture, it became this battle. I was 26 years old before I finally got the Catholic Children's Aid to release enough personal records for me so that I could get a birth certificate. Up until that point in time, I wasn't even legally allowed to leave the country. So once I got that birth certificate, I remember thinking to myself, all of this fighting, it took 8 years of fighting with them to get the information so I could get a birth certificate. And I kind of thought to myself, now the status card thing, this is a whole other ballgame, right? More obstacles, more roadblocks in the way, more stopping you, more making you jump through hoops, more asking you questions for information that you just don't have, you know? And I kind of resigned myself at one point in time to say that, I don't need a piece of plastic from the Canadian government to tell me who I am and where I came from.
Yeah.
I know who I am. And I've just sought out what I need to know through a conversation with Indigenous people myself, building relationships, garnering understanding, and introducing myself to that amazing culture that just stirs you when you're part of it. It moves you. So, and again, as I've said many times, I don't want to ever be viewed as somebody who's sitting in that dark place, because I'm not there anymore. I'm over here and I'm in the light and I'm doing the things that I love to do. And if telling this story helps change perspective for even one person, then it's worth repeating it 100 times.
Yeah. Oh, Valerue, thank you so much for sharing that. That is such a powerful story, and it saddens me to think it would be a common story as well, Valerue. And but just to think of you as an 18-year-old, such a young age, having that resilience and strength to really stand up and fight back. I am just so proud of you, and what you've achieved through some terrible circumstances. And it's interesting you talk about not being able to get a passport. I have a colleague whose mother was given a date of birth, and sadly still to this day cannot access a documentation for birth certificates to get a passport. So it's happening today, Valerue.
Isn't that shameful?
Yeah.
I mean, really, that we still have those structures in place that allow this to continue. Right?
100%.
And that's one thing that I ask everybody. It's like, I am not one to point fingers. I am not one to hold a grudge or to be angry or to lay blame. My energy is better spent elsewhere.
Yeah.
The one thing that I do ask people to do is, aside from the fact that it's like, take the opportunity to believe someone when they have the courage to tell you their story.
Yeah.
And if you really want to do something to help facilitate change, make sure that the institutions around you do not allow these things to continue to happen.
Yeah.
That's how we can all work together, right? That's how we build things. I call it, my favorite saying with this is that, reconciliation is truly a two-way street. It truly is. And if we have peace, friendship, and mutual respect, we are going to accomplish this, because we can't wait for government to do it.
Yeah. And Valerue, talking about how you focus on positive energy, can you share with us what you're actually doing today to make a difference for First Nation Canadians?
Absolutely. I love this, right? So how much time do we have? No, I'm just kidding, Mark. So I'm very fortunate to be able to say that I work for 3 incredible organizations. The Aboriginal Apprenticeship Board of Ontario, where I am a community engagement coordinator. I was brought into the organization to assist with their national expansion to the provinces of British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and New Brunswick. Ultimately, our mandate and our goal through the Aboriginal Apprenticeship Board is to increase opportunities for Indigenous youth and their communities to have equitable access to education, training, and employment opportunities through apprenticeship. And by fostering those discussions with stakeholders and rights holders. There's a difference between the two. So asking stakeholders, again, people of courage, to come forward and recognize that there's a system that's been in place and we need to change it. How are we going to do that collectively? So it's a huge passion of mine. I love working with the Aboriginal Apprenticeship Board. I think I would probably volunteer my time for them if they didn't pay me. And The other organization I work for is Workforce Warriors. They are a national non-for-profit, Indigenous-led organization based out of New Brunswick. My role with them is that I am their senior advisor for labor relations and mentorship, which I think is a key piece for all young Indigenous people. Having somebody who is not there to judge, but to guide. And with that organization, they have a two-pronged approach with the way that they interact with the Indigenous communities and their initiatives. They have an Indigenous leadership program that they are developing so that we can help Indigenous youth identify the leadership within themselves, right? We're not talking political leaders here. We're talking about the leader within each of us. And they also have a skill to work program. So I have a very deep construction background through my experiences. So I love skill to work programs, especially for underrepresented groups. I created Ontario's first ever pre-apprenticeship training program in welding and plumbing for women back in 2012. And it was 100% successful. And again, it's having stamina to stand up to government. And, when they ask you the questions of, is this going to work? And say, well, I guarantee you 100% failure rate if you don't give me the money. Right? And finding ways to take the no away from organizations and individuals and finding that common ground so that we can be successful. So the other organization that I work for, another one of my passions, I work for Workers' Health and Safety Centre here in Ontario. I am a field training services representative with them for occupational health and safety across all sectors. So these are the sorts of things that keep me busy. And they keep me hopping. My latest project that I've been asked to participate in is the Canadian Standards Association. So they are sort of like the flagship of safety standards across the nation here in Canada. They have been contracted to develop the first national standard for equity, diversity, and inclusion in apprenticeship programs. And I am honored to be the chair of their technical committee for the development of that standard. So, yeah, that's wow. In a nutshell.
That you are one busy person, Valerue. I couldn't help but think how proud your ancestral spirits must be from the struggle that you've had as such a young person to where you are now. You've kept fighting the fight, and you're making such a difference for your people over there. So, a big congratulations, sis.
Thank you so much, Mark. And I know that your story after you and I spoke, it was rolling through my mind for quite some time as I just kind of took it and I digested it and I absorbed some of the things that you told me. And I'm going to ask you some questions now. And knowing that you have had some similar challenges, how did your family reveal their identity as Indigenous people?
Yeah, that's such an interesting story, Valerue. And sadly, again, it's very, very common. But I was raised by a single mum. My grandmother was very dark-skinned, and she basically told my mum that dark skin came because we were of Spanish gypsy descent. And so my grandmother passed when I was very young, but I do still remember her singing to me in a language that I didn't understand, but just to soothe me. And so growing up, my mum also thought that we were of Spanish heritage. And when I was a little boy, and I'm showing my age here now, my hobby was collecting stamps. And my most favourite stamps were ones from Spain, thinking that I had that connection with my ancestors. But interestingly, during my youth, I always wanted to be with Aboriginal people. So my best friend at primary school was an Aboriginal person. Whenever I saw a group of Aboriginal people, my spirit wanted to be with them. So there was a strong connection. It wasn't until my mother had breast cancer that she decided to focus on other things. So she started to trace our family tree, and it didn't take long for her to find out there was no Spanish heritage, but we're actually First Nations people, Aboriginal people from here in Australia. At the time, I must admit, we both weren't shocked, I think, but we were initially quite saddened to think that we were totally disconnected from our culture. And then we felt a lot of sadness towards our grandmother, who obviously kept our Aboriginal identity a secret. And I understand now the reason why she did that. So for over 100 years in Australia, it was government policy to remove Aboriginal children from their families, especially if you were had some European heritage in your bloodline. And these children were taken from families, communities, and sent to institutions throughout New South Wales. And these institutions, and I've spoken to a lot of the stolen gen survivors, these were hell on earth. Some terrible things happened in these institutions. So my grandmother was obviously concerned about my mother being taken, and that's why she lived that lie, which was extremely sad to think that she passed still not being able to share the truth with her own daughter and grandson. My mum was one tough character. She was short stature. She had a very high-pitched voice, but she struggled a lot through her life and made many sacrifices to raise myself and my brother. So I wasn't surprised when she said to me, "Oh, Mark, I want to connect with Mob. I really want to." And she asked me to come along with her. So she made an appointment to go to go bush, go and meet where my grandmother's ancestors came from. We didn't know how we'd be received. We had no idea if we would be accepted or rejected, but I'm so proud that I was with Mum on that journey. When we arrived and we were asked to come in, my mum, being the elder, did all the speaking, and she answered any questions. And I remember looking up at her, thinking how proud I was of her. And I felt how proud her mum, my grandmother, would be as well. We're asked to leave the room, and I sat outside with Mum, and it seemed an eternity, but it must have been about 10 minutes. And I embraced my mum, hugged her, and I told her how proud I am. However this turned out, I'll never forget this moment. When we were called in, again, we didn't know what to expect. But when we walked in, everyone in the room got up, surrounded us, embraced us, and said, "Welcome home." It was such an emotional moment. I had tears, my mum had tears, but it was like a generation it took for us to reconnect with our mob. What came of that was my mum. I think she was making up for lost time. So she became extremely active in community. And in 2007, for all the work she did for our mob, she was awarded Elder of the Year on the Central Coast, which is probably one of the largest Aboriginal groups in New South Wales, possibly Australia. So it was great recognition. And I've actually, sadly, I lost my mum in 2016. But I've followed her journey, and I always do my best to try and support mob here in Australia. So, but again, Valerue, my story is extremely common, and sadly there's people out here in Australia now that don't even know that they're of Aboriginal descent. So they're totally disconnected, and which is extremely sad, because I always think our ancestors, doesn't matter how fair your skin is, if you're connected to those ancestors, they would be proud of you, not worrying how dark or how light you are. but you're connected to them. So
Yeah, I love your story, and I look forward to the day where we can spend some additional time just having
yeah,
these types of conversations. Um, I you raised some very interesting points. Residential schools have reared their ugly head here in Canada again, and I'm sure that it's a global story now. Um, and again, for so long we heard, um, but it was so long ago.
mm-hmm.
You need to get over it. That was always it seemed the non-indigenous solution was just stop talking about it.
Yeah,
you know um, and what isn't well known globally is that the last residential school in Canada closed in 1996. That is our lifetime,
yeah,
and every single one of us who is alive in 1996 is witness to these things. So now that we have the discovery of bodies of Indigenous children who died in residential schools, there are thousands of them now, thousands.
mm,
Um, and these are the things that are coming up again now. Again, I say we are witness to this in this day and age. We are all witnesses to what is happening. This isn't so long ago. This is the today. This is the now.
mm,
We are all partaking in the telling of accurate history, right? And I think it's important that while sometimes it can be uncomfortable, that we take the opportunity to just absorb that discomfort.
yeah,
Each of us individually absorb it,
mm,
because that is exactly the feeling that was created by these acts that were committed, right?
mm,
Uh, One of the other things that you do, which I am a big fan of as well, um, is mentorship programs.
mm.
Um, and I was wondering what you are working on with the Department of Education to support the upskilling of the First Nations youth in Australia.
Well, it goes back to 2016, Valerie. At Transport for New South Wales piloted a reverse mentoring program, which had Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people within Transport matched with senior leaders within Transport. And what the magic was, the the mentors actually learnt as much as the mentees throughout that program. So a lot of the mentors had never met an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person, which is remarkable. But and this program has grown, and in 2021, the program was acknowledged, winning a national award. It was recognised within New South Wales as well, but it was also a case study in the State of the Public Service, the Commissioner's report, which is remarkable because normally there's only 3 case studies in that report, which is an annual report, and it goes out to the whole public service of New South Wales. The Department of Education and the Department of Communities and Justice saw that case study, and they actually contacted me in Transport and wanted to know more. And I'm really proud to say, Valerie, in August this year, both agencies started exactly the same program. We've had, at Transport, we've had over 100 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people come through the program, and the success rate is remarkable. In our 4th cohort, 50% of participants had moved into more senior roles. But what I'm really pleased about is that the mentors have gone away, and the lessons that they've learned and their connections to culture and to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, they've taken back to their teams, and to see what they've done. So it's filtering through the whole of the public service, which is wonderful. And I think this is the way that we can go forward, is by spending time together, learning each other's culture. And I call it removing eggshells, because a lot of the wider Australian community feel quite uncomfortable in asking Aboriginal people questions. But this program, for an example, removes those eggshells, so you can ask those questions and learn. And it's been it's been a wonderful journey for me, and I'm really pleased to share with you that this year, just recently, my passion for this program, I received a Churchill Fellowship, and next year around this time I will be coming to Canada for a period of time. So I'm sure that our paths will cross, Valerue.
Well, I was just going to say, when you do, you can come on over and stay out back. But out back here in Canada is different than out back in Australia. Out back here means behind the house in the trailer.
That's good to know, Valerue.
Oh, would love to. Definitely going to be putting that in my calendar. Would love to simply sit and meet with you. And it's so interesting. One of the things that you said that really resonates with me too is how we can, how do we broach these topics? How do we remove some of that discomfort so that people have the courage to start speaking and asking questions without them feeling like they're going to say the wrong thing, right? Yeah. Or ask the wrong question. And how do we create that space? And when I say reconciliation, to me is a two-way street. I mean it, right? Yeah. And I think we all need to be stewards of reconciliation. That means when we take a step forward, it doesn't have to be a big step. It doesn't have to be everybody taking that step together. But every individual who takes a step forward, you are now a steward of reconciliation. And you have a responsibility to nurture that step and to protect it. That's how we move forward, right? Each of us, all of us, taking on our own role and responsibility in correcting so much that has happened for everyone, especially for our Indigenous people. So with that said, I wanted to ask you, how did you use your culture as a strength to bring both of these worlds together, Mark?
Yeah, that's a good question, Valerue. And I'd like to start with trying, if you imagine a clock face, and every minute, instead of being a minute, it's 1,000 years. So I look back to colonisation, which happened in 1788. So if you look at that clock face, it happened 23 seconds ago. Yeah. But our culture, we've been here for more than an hour. So I think that really highlights how Aboriginal people have looked after this land for such a long period of time and cared for it. And in our culture, we're connected to Mother Earth, and Mother Earth's connected to us. So the Kamilaroi nation, which is in far northwestern New South Wales, Kamilaroi stands for no having. And I think the values mean that, you don't focus on material things, you share what you have, you only use what you need, you look after each other, everyone the same, and you look after Mother Earth, and Mother Earth looks after you. And I think if the society today had those simple values, I think we would be in such a better shape this world would be in. But we've had a lot of issues here in Australia. We've had severe bushfires, severe flooding, which we're experiencing today. But the wider community now is reaching out to the Aboriginal science. How did you look after this land for so long? So the conversation's changed now. So they're not looking at how the Europeans looked after their land in Europe. They're now asking, how did the Aboriginal people for over 65,000 years care for this land? So the lens has changed, which is wonderful. And I think it's also the wider Australian population, I think, are actually quite proud that they have one of the oldest continuous cultures in the world. And that's cool. That's something, people should be really proud about. Not just our First Nations people, but all Australians.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
I do see a light at the end of the tunnel, and hopefully our Aboriginal culture and science will be, further embraced into the future.
I agree, and it's so interesting because I have some Indigenous friends who live out in BC, and a couple years back there were some horrible landslides, just horrible landslides coming off the mountains. Um, and my one friend from Squamish First Nation and another one from the Okanagan Valley, they said, well, we don't know what the government thought they were doing. We told them, you keep clear cutting forest, that mountain's going to come down.
Mm.
And that's what happened.
Mm.
There's nothing there to hold the land in place anymore. Right. And it was so interesting because my friend in the Okanagan Valley, she says, a lot of properties down here flooded and people were pushed from their homes and everything else. And I said, well, how about you? She says, no, we knew that the valley flooded. Our homes are up there. I just couldn't stop laughing. Right. I just like, oh my gosh, and I think that joining back those parts, like there's some true genius in the things that Indigenous people have done around the world, right? Like for myself, I'm Mi'kmaq, and we were the point of first contact for Europeans when they landed on the coast here, right? I often when we think about some of these things, we could go on forever about the different pieces of European ideology that came over here and changed everything. The doctrine of discovery from the Catholic Church, terra nullius, taking the original people of these lands and considering them nothing more than flora or fauna.
Yeah.
Christopher Columbus, everybody knows the slogan in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue and discovered America. Actually, Christopher Columbus didn't discover anything. Christopher Columbus was lost. And there were millions of original inhabitants already living here.
Yeah.
So I think that when we start telling the truth and putting truth to history and putting things in context, I think that we're going to grow a much better, more embracing community and world across that's my vision for this, right? That truly is. It truly is. And my husband, he teases me. He's like, when are you ever going to stop working? I said, well, when the work's done. When the work's done, I'll stop working, because I think that energy is something that we can, while we have it, we need to use it to the best of our ability. So, Mark, I absolutely love speaking with you. And we are most certainly going to have more conversations like this, my friend. As I said before the program started, I probably have a million good reasons to go to Australia, but you're going to be the top one. I do go.
I'd love to welcome you here, Valerue, and introduce you to our mob here, and we'll definitely be privileged to show you around. And,
I would love it. I would love it. Going to add that to my bucket list, Mark.
Yeah. And what I've got from this conversation, Valerue, and I already knew, but there's so many strong connections with both Australia and Canada with our First Nations people. We've been through such a similar journey, and I think that brings us close together. And I do feel the connection, sis. I feel that we're connected.
Absolutely, Mark. So do I. Yeah. So do I. And it's a pleasure spending time with you. I could speak with you all evening and not even realize time's going by.
Yeah, we'll definitely have further opportunity, Valerue. So
wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful, Mark. Thank you so much. I enjoyed spending my time with you this evening.
Yeah, and it's morning here. So
yes, it's morning there. It's evening here. You're already October 20th, right?
Yeah. I'm just about to start work. So
okay. That's right. That's right. It's an 18-hour difference, isn't it?
Yeah, okay. It is.
Wow. Amazing. Well, I hope you have a wonderful day.
Lovely, Valerue, and good night, and we'll talk soon.
Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.